Thank you all for joining us here today for this very important discussion. If you're not familiar with what's going on this week, it's the first ever Chicago Water Week organized by Current. And this was in response to wanting to bring people together to talk about water. Water is a very broad topic. It covers all sorts of things. But today we are talking about water insecurities from a local and global perspective. Thank you. Shout out to Shipa and Search for Water to helping lead the start of this conversation, because while there's a lot of issues in Chicago and America, there's also a lot of issues going on around the world, and they all have their own core deep-rooted problems and various organizations that are doing amazing work to address that and paths forward to address these different inequities that exist in today's world. And I'm very fortunate here today to have a very eclectic, smart, intuitive, inquisitive, all these different adjectives of speakers that frankly are just a lot better suited to communicate some of these problems and solutions than myself. But introduction about myself, my name is Kevin Sofin. In my day job, I work for a company called Darley that serves first responders. And I have a couple side hustles, one in particular called Responsible, where I buy and sell artisanal craft goods, reinvest the profits into grassroots water projects. And we've done water projects in Flint, Newark, Navajo Nation, and 7 other countries around the world. And I'm a big proponent of grassroots focused water initiatives and believe that you must work with the local communities to get proper initiatives done. That's all about me. And every speaker is going to give about a 60-second introduction after this. And for everyone out there, this is for you. I want you to ask questions in the chat bar or Q&A, and I will ask the other speakers. So without further ado and me rambling, Jeremy, if you want to start giving a little introduction about yourself, and then we'll go around the horn to Joyce, Shipa, and Akeeshea.
Good thing, Kevin. Thanks, so much for having me. So, happy to be joining such a great group of panelists and, have a number of folks on who are interested in such an important topic. My name is Jeremy Orr. I'm an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm on our Safe Water Initiative, which is NRDC's kind of drinking water, program, if you will. I work predominantly on Safe Drinking Water Act enforcement issues, but I really work hand in hand with the most overburdened communities who are facing, water access and water insecurity issues throughout the Midwest predominantly, but support work all over the country as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. Joyce?
Great. Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Joyce Coffee, and I'm based in Chicago. I run a firm called Climate Resilience Consulting, and we focus on supporting cities and the nonprofits, philanthropies, and consultants that support cities in order to create resilience. And the work of creating resilience means that we need strategies, but also something I'll be emphasizing in response to questions today, we need money. We need funding and finance in order to support our grassroots communities and to support our cities in order for them to allocate funding to the least resourced communities within their jurisdictions. So I'm really pleased to be with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Shipa?
Thanks, Kevin, for moderating this. And I also want to thank Akeeshea, Jeremy, and Joyce for joining this conversation. I'm Shipa Alva, the founder and executive director of Surge for Water. And Surge works on providing access to safe water, sanitation, and hygiene solutions to marginalized communities around the world. So we're currently active in Uganda, Philippines, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. And my passion lies in fighting for justice through safe water, because it is a human right. And we're all here to talk about what water security means for life and for communities to thrive. And the reason this conversation came about was because, while Surge has this global focus, we obviously care deeply about our home and where we live. And that is not my area of expertise, and I honestly want to learn more. So selfishly, I was like, if this Chicago Water Week was happening, and I'm like, this is a perfect time for us to get together and really talk about local and global issues and like the parallels between them. And also, I'm sure we're going to get to this, Kevin. In the conversation we had, really talk about like, who are the communities that are impacted, Are we seeing trends where it's certain types of people, certain socioeconomic status, certain races, and just have that open conversation so we can really, start getting to the roots of these issues, whether it's locally and globally. So I'm happy to be here and have this conversation and just have it be completely open and honest between all of us. So thank you.
Thanks, Shilpa. And Akeeshea?
Hi, my name is Akeeshea Daniels, and I live in East Chicago, Indiana, and I am a former resident of a housing complex that was built on top of a Anaconda old lead refinery. So I'm part of the USS Lead Superfund site where I live now here. And I became an activist because I was concerned about the things that was going on in my area and worried about the water as well that we're drinking daily.
Thank you, Akeeshea. And water is a funny thing. It's something that it covers most of the world. It makes up most of our body, but while we all love it, it's sometimes a little complicated to put it into, let's say, categories or buckets, no pun intended, whatever. But it's a very emotional issue, something that has a lot of different deep-rooted context and cultural issues in terms of why there are certain issues around injustice of sorts. And I've had the fortune of working in Flint as well as Newark and Navajo Nation and 7 other countries around the world, but it's different everywhere. And the term water insecurity, I think, is actually different based on who you ask. That's one thing I want to start with a question for all the speakers. You all have 2 minutes of uninterrupted time. You can interrupt each other. But the idea is I want to ask you all sort of, what does water insecurity mean to you? And what does it look like for the community that you live or work in? And if possible, we can just kind of all go around the horn, and maybe I'll start with Jeremy again.
Yeah, sure thing. Man, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like, water insecurity means so many different things to so many different individuals and communities. And I think about the community that I live in, right, and have lived in, majority of my life, and the communities that I work in, kind of in the Midwest and around the country as well. And for me, that security in those communities means it's barriers to access to clean, safe, affordable water, right? And I define access as both, affordability and quality, right? So in the communities that, I live in and I work in, it's the high water bills, right? Where we pay some of the highest water bills in the country. It's the high rates of shutoffs that follow when you can't afford these inexplicably high, water bills. It's water loss, right, by your water system that gets passed off to you, right, before it even, due to their poor infrastructure, before it even hits your home, that gets passed off to you for, to compensate for it. It's water waste in the homes, right? It's outdated, leaking piping that ends up, getting you, even astronomically high water bills because it's outdated. And I think for me, I recognize at the root of all this, much of this is perpetuated by really just limited transparency by water systems who make it almost impossible to access their records and data that actually tell the true stories of many of these communities who are struggling with water insecurity.
Thanks, Jeremy. Joyce, you want to add on to that or give it from your perspective? You're on mute, Joyce.
So for me, one of the things that I think is really crucial is to understand that, especially for communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, recent immigrant communities, issues of water have a lot to do with not only water quality, but also having too much water when we don't need it and not enough when we do. And especially in the context of Chicagoland, I think we can't afford to speak about water issues without talking also about flooding and how stormwater flooding, especially stormwater flooding that ends up in people's basements, has really had a huge impact on our communities. And this impact relates to, of course, public health, because wet basements breed mold and other problems that have an impact on our children and on anyone in our household that has respiratory distress. But also it breeds a lot of mental anguish, because anyone who's ever had their stuff destroyed in a flood knows that it just feels like such an incredible loss. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it breeds decreased property values. And in particular, because so many of our BIPOC communities have had systemic disinvestment for so many years that has had a negative impact on personal property values, the issues of flooding compound that problem and really take away a lot of agency from individuals who are trying to help build wealth for the next generation in their family. So for me, a big issue around equity and water is understanding the questions of stormwater. And I work in a national context and an international context, and I think it's not a surprise to be reminded that in fact around the globe we will have a continuing increase in more water when we don't need it and less when we do. And this is an increase in frequency, intensity, and duration of either the flooding or the droughts. And who bears the biggest burden of these hazards? Of course, around the world and in Chicagoland, BIPOC communities. So I just want to end by saying that that means that all of the policies that relate to land ownership and a healthy life need to be really questioned deeply at city scale, at state scale, and at national scale to ensure that we are actually changing the feedback loop from more disinvestment, more disintegration of property, and more really, buzz-killing problems in the other direction of more thriving, more agency, and more life. But it does require that we look at code, zoning code, we look at mortgages, and we look at how our infrastructure dollars are being spent. So those are three things that maybe we'll come back to at other questions.
Well said, Joyce. And it's not just one thing, and you're speaking within the urban context, within stormwater, it's complicated. But thanks for that. Shilpa?
Yeah, so it's interesting you talked about stormwater, Joyce. So when I first think about insecurity and what the work that Surge does, we are predominantly focused on access, right? So we're out there when I talk about marginalized or vulnerable communities, we're working in communities where you have people living under $1.90 a day, which is what the United Nations considers as extreme poverty. And so you're in situations where in our community, Kabramaito and Kalaki, those are two districts we work in Uganda, for example, there's no electricity, everything's off the grid. You are walking that 6 kilometers a day to collect your water. Oftentimes your water pump is broken. So then you've got to go another several kilometers to another water source. And then that could be an open spring. And if the open spring is not protected, then you have animals such as cows and pigs drinking from the same source, right? So you have this journey that people are going, especially women and children. This is disproportionately in our context, an issue that impacts women and children, more significantly. So here you are trekking to all these water sources, and you're missing school, you're missing a livelihood. So you could be farming as a woman and going out and selling your goods in the market. You could be making things, right? Even caring for your family, but instead you are out there searching for water. And then when you find that water, it could be highly contaminated because of all the just not being protected or just broken pipes, rusted pipes. But then Joyce, when you mentioned the flooding, the communities we work in the Philippines, actually, especially in Haiti and Uganda and Cabramaito, just 2 weeks ago, amidst this pandemic, dealt with a major flood because they're on the banks of Lake Kyoga. And it was just, while we're trying to deal with containing the spread of COVID, then you have massive flooding and people moved out of their homes. And then, similar in Haiti, they're in like a hurricane zone. So every time that happens, you have soil erosion and other things that happen. So even though our mission is focused on access, we cannot avoid anymore that flooding is a real part of the concern. So we are even making sure that in our model that we're considering flood-proof latrines, making sure that the wells we build are, when flooding happens, the contamination from the surrounding area can't get into the source. Which has been really interesting because we've absolutely seen an increase in the flooding. So I just wanted to add on to what you were saying, that yeah, we're seeing it in all our communities, and yeah, it's changing the way we are having to manage what access means.
Well said, Shilpa. I mean, there's so many different cascading domino effects from stormwater or flooding that lead into other issues. So it's just not just one thing that you need to look at. We need a holistic view as we approach these water and security issues. And Akeeshea, so how would you answer that question?
Living here in East Chicago, I'm really concerned about the water that, and some of our infrastructures or the water piping and things haven't been changed in over 100 years. So with us having lead and contamination all over, that was something that we looked into to see about if the lead was in the water as well. So back in August, we had a flooding in people's homes that had been here for 50, 60 years in this area, where the seepage was coming through the basement. We started getting this orange color, rust color in the basements of people's homes. And the water it was knee deep in my grandmother's basement. All of the things were beginning to flip over inside of this water. So it was really hard to, I'm listening to you all talk about flooding and different things. So a lot of things were going on that we had no control over here in East Chicago. So yeah, we've been drinking a lot of bottled water. We really don't use the water here. Me and my family don't. So the water here that is in East Chicago is basically just used for bathing and washing of clothes. We don't use it in any other circumstances at all in my home. We don't. So we go through at least 10 to 12 cases of water within a 2 to 3 day basis.
Wow. Yeah, it seems like bottled water and packaged water, even though it's meant to be maybe something you could take on a road trip or just a short-term Band-Aid, it's now kind of become the norm. Yes. And so that kind of parlays, and Akeeshea will kind of go back on the horn with you on this, and other speakers too. If you feel like adding on to anything, feel free. But this is within this context of how the house that you live in and the area you live in, Akeeshea, and for all the speakers of what this. Earlier I said water insecurity, and it is kind of a hard term to put a true definition to. But now even a harder word, but an important word is this environmental injustice and environmental racism. How, from your eyes, what sort of connections and correlations do you think how that environmental racism and injustice has tied into the fabric of the community that you live in, and how has that sort of shaped where you are today?
Well, going back and doing the research, once I found out about the lead and arsenic in the area and where we lived, I found out that the mayor at the time said that that was the cheapest land of where they built this complex on top of. So I felt like that was a form of environmental justice where they put us off in one area, and it was the lowest of the lowest area of where they knew people couldn't live at. I found out that this land was first sand and dune, where they went through and they just basically covered over this plant with dirt. They filled these holes with dirt. So they were making batteries and different things in there. So this was an area where no one should have ever lived to begin with. And I felt like after reading some of the articles where he talked in the paper, he said that this was a place where they were gonna, that would be like for Negroes and different people, like Latin peoples. I can't remember the name that he used to describe them, but it was very interesting to see how they felt about the people that they moved into these areas. They made them feel like, okay, you work inside of these different plants, so this is closer to where you should go, where you should live, to where you can walk to work. So a lot of people that worked inside of these plants lived in the surrounding areas of this complex. So, it's making me look at everything differently as far as doing my research on where I would move to. And that's something that I want younger people in America to look into what was there prior to you moving there, and do your research on any area where you move to, as far as lead, arsenic, the water, flooding, different things that might damage you later on.
Shilpa, what is environmental injustice and racism and the past? How is the past drive to communicate what it means today?
Sure. And I also just want to comment on what Akeeshea said. It's crazy, right? Like it's not surprising, but just like as you were talking, I'm like, yeah, it was like the cheapest land, which was known to be unsafe, and then they put a housing complex when you're knowingly putting people at risk, and that's happening. I'm sure Jeremy can speak about this more later because he'll see that across, and Joyce as well. They probably have experiencing this across the country, but yeah, that's just very sad to hear. From a global perspective, it's interesting, obviously, I didn't grow up in the US. I'm actually not American. I'm an immigrant here going through the immigration process. And so I didn't learn a lot about the race issues in the US where I grew up, right? Whatever I learned was books and a couple of movies. And then I realized when most recently in the last few months, when this race reckoning is happening in the US more so than since the entire time I've lived here, I realized that a lot of people did not learn it in their school systems, even when you're American. So that was interesting. But as I started to learn more and more about what's been happening in this country, I also started to look at where I can take action, and that is in the countries that Surge works in, right? Because I have control over that. So when I look at the 4 countries that Surge works in, and you can take any one of them, Haiti, Philippines, Dominican Republic, and Uganda, and you can look at the history of oppression and colonization in just decades and decades, I shouldn't say that, centuries in some situations, right? So you take Haiti, just the south of us, under French rule to begin with, then American occupation, and then natural disasters on top of it. I think Uganda was under 300 years of foreign, colonization as well. So you have all of these situations, and then you have systems that are put into place that continue to suppress communities, right? Because you have these foreign systems, that international colonized systems that were put in place a long time ago. And then the aid world has come in and it's sort of an extension of that, because you continue to use these systems, these archaic systems, and we apply aid in the same way. So just starting to really look introspectively at the work that Surge is doing, and to make sure that we are not part of the system. And in any way, even if we are in any small way, how do we address that openly and start basically saying we are not okay with these power structures that used to be in place. So for example, we've reached out to our local partners who, we work very closely with local communities, and we reached out to Florence Ringe in Uganda, and we were like, okay, what is the power structure between you and me, between Popo, which is her organization, and Surge? What do you feel like? Do you feel like we hold the power? But tell us, let's talk openly about how we break this down. And it was a very powerful conversation to have, because there were definitely learnings from our part. We're proud to say that for the most part, we've been conscious of this, but I think what I want to say when we talk about water insecurity in the developing world and the countries that a lot of international orgs work on, look at the history of that country, look at what they've been subjected to for centuries, and do your work in that context, making sure that you are not part of that continuation of unjust structures.
One thing that always sticks out to me, Shipa, that interested in all your thoughts, were the phrase I hate the most, and this is in so many industries, is, oh, that's the way it's always been. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, maybe for 50 years or 100 years. And obviously when you go back to aspects of colonialization, that's a couple hundred years, but the way it's always been doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean that it's the correct thing that we should be doing. And I guess that always seems to me to be the worst excuse to not do something. And it's just the worst reason why there are certain injustices that continue to perpetuate over time. I just wanted to throw it out there that I agree with that. So any other thoughts, or Joyce, if you want to kind of respond to that, and then Jeremy, then you can go after that.
Yeah, I think that, we need to be providing some actual action steps and tools. And one thing that I'm struck by when Akeeshea talks about what her family has to do to have healthy water is that I don't have to do that. And that's pretty amazing. Like, think about the money that you spend, the back-breaking work, honestly. I mean, I don't carry up giant things of water into my house every week. The mess, and all of that, like having to get all that stuff out to the recycle bin and have it on your kitchen counter. Anyway, I'm struck by the fact that, in lower income countries and least developed countries, many people pay more for water than they do for fuel. And what you are describing, Akeeshea, is probably getting close to that here in the United States. And that's a tragedy. And it's something that, we have the power to change. And so I just want to point out a few sort of recommendations around that. One is that we must vote And when we vote, we also must say to our elected officials what matters to us. It matters to me that people do not have to pay more for water than they do for fuel, and that people who are living in other communities have to pay more for water privately, and they're not getting access to the supposedly public good. It's not a public good if not everyone has access to it in a fair way. I think the second thing is that in addition to voting, we need to be sure that the money that's flowing is flowing to areas that have the biggest vulnerabilities instead of to areas that have the best grant application. And by and large, federal funding, state funding, and city funding, government funding, goes to those who have hired a grant writer and can win the money. And that is not fair. That perpetuates further problems. And related to that, I think that it is a tragedy and a travesty that our federal funds for disaster recovery are essentially designed for money to follow money. So that if you are wealthy, you get a bigger disaster recovery purse than if you are poor. And so post-disaster, the data show that poorer people are worse off and wealthier people are better off than they were before a disaster. This is our taxpayers' money. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but I think that we need to be talking very specifically about actions that all of us can take to get around the systemic bias and racism and white supremacy that is part of the system that we're describing. So I'm really encouraging everyone to talk about some specific actions. There are 3. But also we haven't heard much from Jeremy yet.
Yeah. Well, and thank you, Joyce. And that will be the next question after we get hear Jeremy's perspective on the question I'd asked earlier. So we definitely want to talk about action forward and steps forward. So Jeremy, your thoughts on the earlier question?
Yeah, and Joyce, thank you for sharing that. I think you touched on a really important topic. I know a number of my colleagues, we've been working on looking at how state revolving funds are distributed, right, between clean water and drinking water revolving funds. And we realized that, through the data that, these funds that are meant to go predominantly to low income, overburdened, communities of color are going to particularly white communities, middle class, affluent communities, because they have the better applications or they can afford the technical expertise to fill out the applications to get the grant. So that in and of itself is one form of injustice as well that we're becoming more and more familiar with. But I live in an environmental justice community and predominantly work in environmental justice communities, many of which are predominantly Black and brown communities. And I think one prime example that we're living through right now is the disparities in COVID, right? Black and brown communities are experiencing it at much higher rates, contracting it as well as death, right? And it's no surprise that the hardest hit communities in our communities and around the country and probably around the world, right? They are also the communities that don't have access to water. Their water shut off. They can't wash their hands, which is the best thing you could be doing, and they can't stay home because they don't have access to water. So they need to constantly leave and be out exposing themselves. And I find in my actual work, right, on drinking water issues is these same Black and brown communities face higher rates of Safe Drinking Water Act violations, right, in terms of quality of water and compliance amongst the water system that's supposed to be complying with it. And in addition to these violations, we're finding that these same communities, these DJ communities, are less likely to have the violations enforced, right? So the water, the governing body of the water system, the city or the state, is less likely to enforce it. And actually, these communities are also less likely to have an enforcement mechanism remedy, right? So even if it is, even if a water system is cited for a violation in a Black and brown community, it's much less likely that that violation will be remedied. So they'll, continue to live with a water system that's out of compliance. And for me, right, I think I began to realize that it's no mistake because these same communities have, they have the worst air quality. They have the hazardous waste sites. They have limited to no, green space or recreational space. They have, limited access to public transportation and, limited access to quality foods because they live in food deserts, right? And when we think about these cumulative impacts of all these environmental risks, they become dire to these communities. And when you take them together, it becomes more likely that this is by design, right? A design to be discriminatory, to result in some of these environmentally racist or unjust results.
Well said. And I think that the food desert's a whole nother aspect of the injustice too. I mean, I work closely in the Navajo Nation and experience firsthand. I mean, and you look at their diabetes rates, you know, they have some of the highest rates because the only place they can go and eat food at is 7-Eleven or McDonald's. And we take for granted, you know, I live in downtown Chicago and I'm fortunate that I have a grocery store that's 2 blocks away. But many others in the certain communities, you're 100 miles away from a grocery store. And I think the point you just brought up, the cumulative impacts is a big part that I think maybe we can riff on a little bit of. Like, there's so many of these little things, you know, on the surface. One of those things is like, you know, it's, you know, you can get by with that. Maybe you're figuring out a food problem or a water problem, but there's like, when you talk about these 5, 10, 15 little things, that becomes a lot of stress. And Akeeshea, I know you're a mother of 3 children. You know, give us some insight to like being a mother of 3, especially within this aspect of the site, like those little things, like from the having used bottled water to access to food. Like, give us some insights for what are these little things and what's it like having to deal with that, and others feel free to chime in and add on that.
It's really hard to deal with on a daily basis because buying 6 cases of water at a time is very expensive. And having a 16-year-old that's ADHD, he has severe asthma, he has severe allergies. It's really hard to find things that he can eat, where he can play, where he can be active outside from day to day, especially with the COVID going on. A lot of our gyms and different things are shut down, so he has no activities to do outside. Where I live at is right next to a pipeline runs along the side of a gas pipeline runs along the side of my home. So the fumes, the diesel fumes that we are exposed to on a day-to-day basis are really hard. And we don't have a fresh food store. We don't have where we can get fresh fruits, or we don't have a garden. We can't plant anything because of the soil being so contaminated here in East Chicago. So it's hard to find food, and it's expensive when you do find what you do need. So, you know, we were meeting with the mayor at one time trying to get, you know, someone to build a above ground gardening or a greenhouse for the people to be able to go get fresh fruits and different things, but finding out that the water was contaminated, then it's not contaminated, then you're reading articles that it is. It's just, you don't know what to believe around this area, and you can't get a straightforward answer from anybody. You know, people that work for the city or work for the government here, they tell you one thing, and then when you get in the room with everyone, it's something totally different. So, you know, I just felt that using bottled water was the best thing for me and my family at this time. And, you know, they did replace our service lines from the outside into the homes, but no one's done anything inside of your home to test any water to see if maybe those pipes and stuff that had been down there for years, or what were they made from, you know, what was the materials that they were made. No one's told us anything. The city just showed up one day with people to put the lines in, and that was it. So.
Thank you for that context. And it's hard to, I think about myself as a 16-year-old, I just wanted to go run and throw balls and be a kid. And then not being able to, just having to think about where to play and think about where to eat. There's just so many issues that you have to think about. And I know that adds on the stress. So
and can I say one more thing?
Please.
It's also where we lived, we had over 1,100 residents that were in this area. So we all were removed and uprooted. So there were a lot of children with a lot of behavior problems, like as if my son being moved or restructuring his day was kind of hard when we first moved out of the complex. You know, there were days that I still drove there to go in the complex and it was gone. You know, it was like a daily routine of places that we went. So about 660 kids were displaced from this area. And not only were they displaced from this area, these children were moved into other sites that are contaminated as well, if not more highly contaminated than the ones that we already lived in. So these children have been just uprooted, and their whole structure of day-to-day living has been totally disrupted. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's easy for us to maybe, not easy, it's important to talk about the core of the problems. We talked about environmental injustice, colonialization, the modern day colonialization with aid work. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie or the documentary Disaster Capitalism. It's a great watch. I'll put the link in there. It's this modern day dynamic in Haiti where a lot of aid groups don't actually want to solve the problem, because if you solve the problem, you don't need the aid group anymore. It's a weird dynamic going on, but I want to provide some ideas for a way forward for everyone that's listening, and now or after the fact. But what are some tangible things that John Doe somewhere in South Carolina can do to help, or an organization that wants to get involved? Like, give us some work that you're doing right now, and maybe some ideas on how individuals or organizations can get involved. And if Jeremy, if you want to start us off with that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so I know for my work, we're looking at a number of different ways to tackle this issue of water insecurity in particular. I think for us the most immediate thing that we should be doing around the country, and particular in Illinois and Chicagoland and other places, is getting the lead pipes out of the ground, right? I think City of Chicago just announced a lead service line replacement program, right, to replace all the lead pipes. Chicago has the most lead pipes of any city in the country, and Illinois as a state has the most lead pipes of any state in the country, right? And so, I'll be working with the city to revamp that program. However, there's like a stakeholder engagement process, right, that involves community, having an opportunity to give input on what that program should look like, right? So I think it's the opportunities to show up and engage when it's so important. So I think that's kind of one opportunity, and realizing that these types of processes are taking place all over the country, and it's just being in tuned and as much as possible being available to make your voice heard. I think another thing we're working on at the state level is in Illinois right now, kind of duplicating what we were able to do in Michigan, which is get a statewide mandate to replace all the lead service lines, in the state. I think that'll be critical. And then another piece of that work is affordability measures, as we talk about access being a few different things. And for me, a big part of that is, can you afford your water? In addition to, is it even clean enough to drink? Revamping rate structures that prioritize, not just consumption and use, but actually your ability to pay, right? That look at your income and says, okay, your water consumption or your water access should be measured by what you need, not, what you're able to pay and what you consume. I think another piece of that is assistance measures. While we work out these processes of revamping rate structures to make sure that they're affordable, there still needs to be stopgap measures like assistance in place so that the hardest hit communities and homes who may not be able to afford these astronomical bills can have some relief. And I think, just the last thing is, especially in the midst of COVID, is, securing continued water access, right, no matter what. So it should look like these, moratoriums that we've seen in Chicago on shutoffs and that we're seeing other places. Just the ability to say, okay, regardless of what's going on, water is a human right. You should have access to it no matter what.
Thanks, Jeremy. Joyce, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, first I want to just come back to Akeesha's point that, her family was displaced based upon the lack of public service and many other problems that are publicly driven, and public problems are problems. And while we talk about displacement in Akeesha's context that relates to lead in water, I wanted to also remind us that there are many communities around the United States who are or will be displaced due to too much water. Again, coming back to that point, coastal communities in particular. And there, not surprisingly, it is people of color who are being displaced the first, and whose property values are plummeting with no recourse. And so one thing that I'm really struck by and struggling with in this conversation is that we should be, this region, the recipient of many, many families in the next 10, 20, 30, and 40 years as the intensity of climate changes grow. And if we cannot receive them with grace and allow for an extraordinary life for them here in Chicagoland, it will be just a remarkable decrease in social equity, as if we could get any worse. So, you know, all of us need to step up and think about and act upon strategic growth objectives that actually help us to transform our communities. One that I really like is the California Strategic Growth Council's Transformative Climate Communities program. It requires local governments to develop an anti-displacement plan, for one, among other things. I'll put it in the chat. But if I had another 3 things that I think that we should do, they all come back to this point about voting and then advocating, once we have voted, that our public officials act differently than they are right now. And I mean every public official. I do not just mean someone on the other side of our voting ticket. So for instance, general obligation bonds are the way that cities tend to fund their infrastructure improvements. And by and large, those monies from those bonds have gone to wealthy communities. But there are growing examples of general obligation bonds that have tried to serve the question of systemic racism. Like in Miami, they have a Miami Forever bond, which combines affordable housing, so money for affordable housing, along with flood mitigation. So it's a pretty robust example of cities actually trying to decrease racism, improve housing, decrease flooding, and give everyone a fair shot at a good life. Another example, and this is where I'll stop, and there are several others, but community land trusts. These are tools that partnering between cities and local institutions, by which I do mean grassroots institutions, but of course the grassroots institution has to have the money and time to get through the gauntlet with the city, so it's not an easy process. But these community land trusts have a goal to protect community resources for both environmental and community benefit, and they inspire community-based ownership and control of land. One thing I'm hearing so frequently from the grassroots communities that I work with is this incredible lack of control. There's no control over their own life, the life of their 3 children, the life of their parents. Everything seems very, and is in fact, out of their hands. And so I am very fond of a community land trust model, and there are good examples around the United States of where this has effectively begun to decrease racism and white supremacy and improve outcomes and quality of life for all people.
Thank you, Joyce. Well said and well stated. Shilpa, you want to add on to that and give your insights?
Well, I think maybe I should go after Akeeshea, since I'm going to go into like the global conversation, okay, maybe for better flow.
Yeah, sounds good. Akeeshea, if you want to go from there.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Who am I again? No, the question is some of the way forward in terms of, there's obviously a lot of these underlying issues that we've talked about, but Jeremy and Joyce talked about some of these different community-led programs with engagement, some policy-led initiatives. But from your perspective, I know you're a very passionate activist and you're leading some good stuff. What are some things that you're doing, and what are some things that others within your community, within America, that you could shine some light on what others can do to get involved to help take action and move forward?
The biggest thing that I would like for people to do is get involved in their neighborhood. We have a CAG group, a community action group that we have here in East Chicago. It's called the East Chicago Calumet Coalition Action Group that we started. It was me and some members that were tired of what was going on in our area. We sat down, we've met with the mayor several times. I've met with the governor for the first time in 40 some years of living in this area. I met with my governor for the first time. I've met with Scott Pruitt. I met with Ben Carson. I've met with a lot of people that were promising us things that were going to get done and nothing happened. So the first thing is to get a seat at the table, I would say, for people to start going to their local community meetings with their mayor and different city officials, So we've done that. When we first started being removed from the complex, I did have friends that came from other parts of Indiana. We donated water to different residents inside of the complex and outside. They did have groups that were donating water to us, so we have done that. But just get to the table. That would be the biggest thing that I would tell people to do, is try and get to the table and voice your opinion about what you like and what you don't like about what's going on in your area, if you ever run into this type of problem that we're having here in East Chicago.
Right, so I can jump in now, Kevin. I just wanted to make sure that, since we were talking about local, national, domestic action, that conversation could be tied in. And it's such an honor to be here with you, Akeeshea, and obviously Jeremy and Joyce, the work you're doing as well. And, first of all, I want to say, reiterate everything that they said, like, please, like, Joyce's comment about voting or getting involved and like having a seat at the table. I mean, all of those things are really important. And for those of you who are listening, who are interested in the international perspective, I mentioned this earlier, but the global water crisis predominantly affects women and children. Yet women and children do not have, especially women, have no very little, I should say, no decision-making power. They're very, very often left out of the conversation. So when we're working in communities, in small villages in Uganda, it's the men who gather around the water source, and they're the ones who are like, oh, this is what we should do. Whereas it's the women who are going and collecting water daily. So when, Kevin mentioned this earlier, like even with his work with Responsible, and Surge is similar, like we make sure that when we are working in our communities, we are ensuring that all voices are heard. So similar to what Akeeshea is saying, making sure that voices who are actually are suffering from the situation are included in the conversation. So I guess I invite everybody who is donating to any foreign organization, international organization, whether it's for water or for any other purpose, how is that work being done? Who is in that conversation? Is it Americans going there and doing the work, or are local people on the ground owning their own transformation? Are they responsible? How much power, how much control do they have? And this is probably the most important thing you can do in providing international aid, because it is so important that local voices are heard, and in countries like Uganda, or just Black and brown communities, are women's voices being heard? Because it's not enough that the men, the government leaders, are the ones creating the policy, because the people impacted by these issues need to be part of that conversation, right? So how is the work being done? Ask the organizations you're doing, and they should be able to answer. And really nowadays, this information should be easily found on their website, on their social media pages. We're making a conscious effort to do that, to educate our donor bases. And we still have a lot of work to do, but that's, I think, really important. The other thing is there are so many amazing Black and brown voices in this place right now, especially Black voices. There's orgs like PopWorks Africa, No White Saviors, New Humanitarian, and DevEx are starting to put out great articles about racism in the aid world. And a lot of that relates to water, but beyond water. So again, anybody who cares about international development and humanitarian work, it's important to understand how racism plays a role in it. In addition to the movie that Kevin suggested, so this is an old one, but I think it's actually quite well done. It's called Poverty, Inc. So more of you might have seen that, but again, how the aid world has become an industry and why that's not okay. Again, going back to like, how do we eliminate ourselves from this job, making sure that local communities. So when you are donating to organizations, or you're making any sort of, I guess, locally and internationally, I think it's our responsibility to truly understand that the money is going to continue to uplift the voices who are actually being affected by the issue.
Thanks, Shipa. One thing that I heard from a lot of you on this is the stakeholder engagement. I think that is a point that is so critically important, where, being a white man, I went into Flint and I've done projects, but I had some experiences where I had certain people being like, who the F are you and why are you trying to help? But I also know that I've seen other orgs that come in and say, you need bottled water, you need point of use filters. And it's easy to kind of take a square, or a lot of times people taking a square and just shoving it down the circle hole no matter what, because they just want to take money and put it towards a solution and take pictures. But then you're just ultimately making the problem worse. You see this a lot in Africa, where it's, let's plug a straw in the earth and drill a well and sayonara, let's go off. But I think I want to hear a little roundtable on that aspect of community engagement and stakeholder engagement. Like, how can we turn the volume up on that a little bit? I think, Jeremy, you mentioned some aspects of that, but is it door to door? Are we using social media well enough? I mean, how can we get to the root of understanding the problems in the community so we can make sure that, to Shilpa's point, if I'm giving money to an organization, I want to know that that money is not going into some overhead or some stupid solution that's going to make the problem worse. So let's talk about that, community and stakeholder engagement. How do we turn the volume up on that, and what are some good success stories with that?
Yeah, I'll say for me, before I got into law, I was a community organizer, right? I worked in grassroots organizing for years before deciding to go to law school. And one thing that I recognized was, and I carry with me in my work now, right, in legal and policy advocacy, is that, communities are the experts on their own experiences, right? No matter how much legal and policy and technical expertise I can bring with a large organization, right, that has the resources, we'll never be able to drop in and solve their problems, right, in ways that, that they can't without needing us, right? And I think it's important to understand that for me, when I show up in these communities and when these organizations show up in these communities, it should be to provide support in the way that communities are asking for support. And that's critical, right? So it's getting rid of your preconceived notions and kind of, as you mentioned, right, dropping in with your solutions on how to fix it and leave. But no, people understand what's going on. People know what needs to be done. And we need to be, us in positions to provide that support, need to be listening, flexible, and showing up in the ways that we are asked to show up. And I think that's really critical.
Jeremy, I just want to add to what you said. So that what you're saying is exactly how Surge works, and like it applies in the international context as well. But it's actually, when you go in as a foreign organization and put your views in a community, that is a form of racism too, especially if you're not part of that community, because you believe that you know better. And how do you know better? You're not from the community. You do not experience the issue. And if you are doing that as a person not from that community, it is like racism if you are from a different race doing it. So I just want to point out that that's something that we see all the time in international development, and it is wrong and needs to stop. And it clearly needs to stop here as well.
I think
yeah, absolutely.
The key thing that I took from that too is you got to do water initiatives or any social impact initiative with the community, not for the community. I don't know, but so let's figure it out. And Akeeshea, I know you mentioned the community action groups that you're doing. How is that going, and sort of how do we build upon that? How is that replicatable, scalable throughout other places within the Midwest and around the country, around the world? I mean, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, we started the group when we found out we weren't getting any answers from, as far as the I can't think, the EPA, I'm believing, in Region 5. When we couldn't get the answers that we were looking for, we started this group to see what other steps we could take towards forcing the hands of them to give us the information that we needed. But it was kind of rough getting started with this group. We had a lot of people that, I think a lot of people have just been silent for so long, and just been going along to get along. So a lot of people didn't want to join these groups, and they first thought we were like a cult, almost like trying, because we were knocking on doors and going door to door trying to get people just to get the information about if they've had people with cancer and different things in their household. And because we were just finding out that so many people were a lot sicker in this area than we first knew of. We had a lot of stillbirths, a lot of different things that were going on in our area, and no one was trying to find out. So we got with some nurses and we did some footwork. We got out on the streets. We tried to knock on doors. We had a lot of people that didn't want to speak to us. I'm from this area. I got a lot of those looks and stuff that you got going into Flint as well, and some of those choice words as well. But I didn't let it stop me from doing what I felt was best for our area. I even had an officer tell me that some of the things that I was doing, I was lucky that my house hadn't been firebombed, or, you know, someone didn't try and do anything to me or my family, because I was going against the grain, I guess, of what's been just going on for years. It was the norm to let it go. So I'm still part of this group. I'm still going to keep pushing. Me and the 5-6 members that we still have that are still active. You know, we really haven't been doing anything since COVID because a lot of the members are older. So I'm afraid to be around them. And I'm sure they're probably afraid to be around me as well. But once the libraries and different things open up in the area, we're going to get back to doing what we have to do. And I'm not quitting. I'm going to keep going until we can get some answers and we can get some change here in East Chicago. And hopefully it doesn't stop here in East Chicago. It goes throughout everywhere till we get clean water and the air and everything is pure for everybody, not just for me and my family, but everybody in my area as well.
Well said, Akeeshea, and that's awesome. And I do want to be mindful of time. And I just looked at my clock and I was like, oh my gosh, it's almost been an hour. It just, time flies when we were really vibing and riffing like that. So I think there needs to be more of this conversation. We need to expand upon this a lot, obviously, and continue to dive into problems and explore solutions. But I want to give every speaker sort of one last mic drop, one last talking about an idea of the solution, or kind of what do you want for everyone listening now or after the fact when they hear this later. What's kind of one thing that you want them to take from this, or a challenge or something that you want to input, that you want to give to them? So, Jeremy, if that made sense, if you want to start us off, that'd be great.
Yeah, you know, man, I'll part with water as a human right. And I think somebody touched on it earlier, that it should be a human right, but it's seen as a commodity, right? But I think many of us on this call probably all feel everybody should, you know, have access to it. And I think, you know, as you know, professionals in this field and folks who are on this webinar, we're all in a position to do what we can to hold our water systems and decision makers accountable. So as much as possible, right, I think we need to be speaking in one voice and one message, that water is a human right, and these water systems that we're paying rates to, our taxes go to, should be, you know, serving us and getting us quality, affordable water in ways that are equitable and you know, benefit the entire community, even the least of these. So just that message of pushing water as a human right should be consistent moving forward.
Joyce?
Yeah, so 3 things. One, do not assume that the money that is flowing through your communities right now is flowing to the right places. And so you have to change that. You with power, anyone on the phone with power, you have to change that. And all of us have power by, for instance, ensuring that general obligation monies go towards lower income communities, by ensuring that we have grant application that is based upon hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, not based upon the best written proposal. And just to follow on something that Akeeshea just said, that we actually pay for the value of communities getting data, getting people invested. So providing technical support and planning from local governments, resources to less resourced people to help develop resilience within their own communities. And those are all things that we have to demand of our elected officials. And it's not up to just Akeeshea to be going to these community members. We have to fight with at least those tools as well.
Thanks, Joyce. Shipa?
I just think that, I mean, I'm grateful for everybody who's listening and people who will listen to the recording later. And I just say that it's not enough to just be listening. We're hosting this panel because this is an issue that all of us, 5 of us here, and I know several people on this call, are passionate about. I mean, you hear it in our voices. There are issues locally, and there are countless issues globally regarding water insecurity. So I think it's important to just choose one action, whether it's something Jeremy suggested, Joyce or Akeeshea. If you're not going to do that, donate to an organization that's doing great work. There are ways, but take what you've heard here today and do something about it. We've given you so many ideas, and maybe we can even follow up in an email, Kevin, like to everyone listening, with more suggestions when we post this video. But I think that's the most important thing, to take action. It's not enough to just listen, switch off the Zoom call and continue into your next meeting. Please do something.
Thanks, Shipa. Akeeshea, to round us off here.
My biggest thing is if something doesn't feel right to you, find out, get your people together, find a group of friends. That was my biggest thing. Get a group of friends and do your research and vote. Vote them in or vote them out.
Well said. And to everyone's point, I think sometimes these problems seem too big or impossible to solve, but it's how do you eat a 500-pound gorilla? It's one bite at a time. You can't do it yourself, so you surround yourself with others. So Jeremy, Akeeshea, Shilpa, Joyce, you're all rock stars and really inspirational. And to everyone listening now and after the fact, I challenge you all, like Shilpa said, don't just turn off your computer and go take a nap. Sleep's important, but just do something, do anything, get involved. And all of us are accessible. Find us on LinkedIn, email. We want to be available and be of value and resource to you. So I thank you all for your time and listening today. To all the panelists, thank you so much. Keep fighting the good fight. And I look forward to talking to you all and seeing you all again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.